Hi there, it's Matt here, and welcome back to another AMA episode, another Ask Me Anything episode. And the brilliant, the dazzling, the lively, the sparkling, the glimmering, glittering, shining, smart, twinkling individual who is asking me the anything part of that is, of course, the wonderful Doctor Eti Ben-Simon. Eti, welcome back.
Hi, everyone. Great to be back.
So let's just dive straight in. As the kids say, hit me up with the first question.
I'll hit you up. The first question is about cannabis. What is the intersection between
Oh
cannabis and
no.
sleep health? That's right. You wanted to dive in. We're diving in.
Okay. Talk about a third rail lightning rod topic. You know what? It's a timely question. I get asked this question a huge amount. Why don't I do this? Because here in the AMA, I'm going to try and get through more questions because I've been dawdling my way through all of these so far. And we usually get like 2 or 3 questions at best. I'm going to try to move through these questions quicker so you get more bang for your buck in terms of time investment. So let me give you the high level contours and sort of key messages here, because that way I will give people the information, and then don't worry, I will go into greater depth in more detailed standard episodes. And really, this is me going to focus on THC, which is the principal psychoactive component of cannabis. It's the thing that gets you high. And it's the thing that most people will target and use and historically have used when it comes to sleep. So really this is, yes, cannabis, but it's probably more THC info specific. And I will speak about CBD at a later point. For THC, the reason that most people begin using it is because THC, if you look at the data acutely, meaning that when you start using it in the first or second or third or even first couple of weeks, it does seem to have a sleep effect that for those people is desirable. And I'm choosing my words very carefully. What I mean by that is it can help you fall asleep. And when we bring people who are cannabis naive into the laboratory and we give them THC, and usually a standard dose, it's a controlled dose, it does make them fall asleep more quickly. The problem, however, is that, well, there's multiple problems there. It does do other things to their sleep that are not desirable. The first thing is that once you start using it frequently, once you transition from acute use, short term, to chronic use, long term, you suffer disrupted sleep patterns. You can have challenges with your circadian system. In fact, there's some literature that says that it can alter your circadian system almost as though you start to shift to become more sleep desiring of the waking daylight hours and less sleep desiring of the nighttime hours. Another component is that it can increase central brain temperature if you look at some of the animal studies. And that's the opposite of usually what we want for good continuity and quality of sleep once you fall asleep. Because as people have heard on this show many times before, you need to drop your brain and body temperature to stay asleep and get into that deep sleep. Those are some of the initial things that will happen with chronic use. And then with continued chronic use, here starts the bigger problems. You begin to develop a tolerance, and therefore the amount that you took before to get these quote unquote falling asleep benefits no longer produce the same benefits. So you have to start using either more frequently to get that sleep that you have now become dependent on cannabis for, or you need to start taking a higher dose. And that is a demonstration of dependence, and it's a demonstration of tolerance, that your system starts to build up a tolerance, and therefore you either need to use more frequently or a higher dose. The next thing, and I've certainly spoken about this, I think, in public, THC is pretty good at disrupting both the quantity and the quality of your REM sleep, of your dream sleep. And as we've spoken about on this podcast, dream sleep is critical for things like learning and memory processing, particularly associating new information together, creativity and insight, memory insight, problem solving. There are also functions of REM sleep that are linked to your emotional and mental wellness. And with disruptions in REM sleep, we see disruptions in your emotional regulation. You become more emotionally short fused. You can slip down towards the negative end of the emotion spectrum. So, if some of those things feel familiar and you're using THC for your sleep, it could in part be because of the blockade of REM sleep. One of the best demonstrations that cannabis is blocking your REM sleep is that people will firstly say, you know what, I don't remember many of my dreams once or since I've started smoking weed to try to fall asleep. And that's in part because you're reducing the amount of REM, so you're dreaming less. And then if people stop using, they have these really intense, really crazy dreams. And we describe that in sleep research as the sleep rebound model. And it's often used as a measure of a demonstration that you need a certain stage of sleep, that if you deprive an organism of that stage of sleep, yes, some things get bad. But also, if it's that necessary, then when you stop blocking it, not only does it return, but it returns in even greater volumes, demonstrating that there had been a developed hunger and need and necessity for that sleep. So you're in a debt, and the brain tries to get back some of that debt. The problem is that you never get back all that you lost. But that's another demonstration. People will say, gosh, I was just having these crazy dreams once I stopped smoking weed. I should also note REM sleep is not just there for memory, emotion, it's there for the body. There was a great study, I should do a podcast on this one, from Harvard, and they looked at sleep duration, and sure enough, using that 7 to 9 hours as a sweet spot, nothing more, but 7 to 9 hours, what they found was that the shorter your sleep, in general, the shorter your life. But when they looked at the different stages of sleep, there seemed to be one stage of sleep that predicted all-cause mortality most potently, and it was REM sleep, and it was a linear relationship. The less and less you got, the higher and higher your death risk. The more and more you got, the better your mortality prediction. And there wasn't this U-shaped function that we see with total sleep, where once you get past that 9 hours, things can start to hook back up in terms of mortality risk. And what they demonstrated, just for people to keep this in mind when they're maybe smoking weed, taking cannabis or gummies, THC, and they're blocking their REM sleep, what that study found, and it wasn't looking at THC use, it was just looking at REM sleep in general. And what they found was that for every just 5% reduction in REM sleep, there was an associated 13% increase in mortality death risk rate. And that suggests a critical importance of REM sleep for overall health and longevity. Some of the other things that start to happen when you're using THC, you can start to suffer from memory impairment. Some of that will be related to sleep. Some of it is just the effects of THC and cannabis on the memory systems, because your textbook like memory structure in the brain, something called the hippocampus, has these cannabinoid, these natural cannabinoid receptors, and you can impact it in that way. I would say that other than the REM sleep blockade, the principal reason that sleep science does not currently advocate for the use of cannabis or THC is because of what happens when you stop. You will suffer a really vicious insomnia. And in fact, if you look at something called the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Health, it's basically the psychiatrist's handbook for diagnoses. If you look at cannabis use disorder, the definition of cannabis withdrawal syndrome, and there is such a thing, has top and center sleep disruption. And you get a really quite vicious insomnia rebound. And indeed, if you look at the data on why people relapse from their attempt for abstinence from cannabis, the main reason is that they say, my sleep just got so bad, I couldn't take it anymore, and I just had to start using again. So, those are some of the downsides that I feel responsible to tell you about. I also feel responsible to tell you about any emerging data that would say, is there anything good about cannabis? And there may be very tentative, nowhere near clear enough for any recommendation whatsoever. So you can see how much of a disclaimer I'm putting in there. Therapeutic potential in a very specific population. And that population is a population of a set of patients with a sleep disorder that we've spoken about also here, which is called sleep apnea or heavy snoring. And there was an early set of studies that hinted at when people were saying that they were using THC or being administered THC, there seemed to be a slight reduction in the severity of the sleep apnea, of the snoring, and the different snoring metrics that we use. And then there was a study that followed up, and it used a much more stringent experimental design. And they used a medically controlled synthetic cannabidiol, and it's called dronabinol. What they found was that dronabinol significantly reduced the number of apnea events, which is where you stop breathing, with a modest but significant 32% reduction in apnea severity over several weeks of drug administration compared to placebo. So I would say that that's interesting data. I don't think it's anywhere near, these are not randomized clinical controlled trials. We have no idea. But I also feel it's responsible to give a representative view of the data. The other maybe caveat you could say of a potential upside is that a collection of patients will report decreasing their use of the older prescription sleeping pills that right now modern day medicine doesn't necessarily advocate for. And so perhaps there could be some combination of medical grade cannabis and the different analogs of that are useful, that don't get you high, maybe don't have as many side effects, but have the benefit of allowing people to maybe transition to some of the newer sleep medications or transition to cognitive behavioral therapy. So it could be a bootstrapping bridge to better sleep salvation, because getting off those classic sleeping pills is really difficult too. So those, I think it's probably closer to what, like 11 or 12 points rather than 9 or 10. But I don't know if that was helpful, Eddie. And do you have any thoughts or additions there, such as your wisdom?
That was fascinating. I didn't know about the apneas. I wonder if it means that their sleep is actually becoming more shallow.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the mechanism right now, and I'm really trying to remember this paragraph in the paper, as I said, I have this strange sort of visual memory. And I believe they were suggesting that it may not necessarily be an effect on deeper slow wave sleep, which you're right, it could be, because that's where often things can get even more severe with sleep apnea, but also in REM sleep too. They were suggesting that it could be due, I believe, to changes in histamine regulation in the body and the respiratory function of serotonin or 5-HT. So I think the mechanism is very unclear. And I think that that was that lovely paragraph that you wait for in these types of papers where the science is great. They've done all the experiments. The stats are great. And, I think a discussion, which is the final part of a scientific paper, you have an introduction, you have a methods, a results section, and then a discussion. Once you've done it all well, you kind of have a little section where, okay, get a bit more loosey goosey, say it's interesting to hypothesize or it's intriguing to suggest. And it's just that. And that's fine. That's great. And that was the sort of moment of hand waving as to
Hmm.
what it could be. So it just your question triggered my mind there. So thank you for that.
Yeah, the discussion is where you can dream.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is where so much of our fun stuff happens at the Sleep Center, where we're discussing a new finding. And we usually try to, we're probably pretty vicious for a new finding. We try to rip it apart internally before we even think about writing a paper, because we want to make sure that we do the best job possible to make it as watertight as possible so that reviewers have the easiest time with it. But then another part of that discussion is, once the boxing gloves have been put back on after they've been taken off to pulverize the data, we have a great fun time talking about mechanism and pontificating. It's this kind of like scratchy beard moment for some of us. And you're like, ooh, okay, well, what about, well, and that's where I think they went with that paper. Okay.
Do we want to talk about CBD?
I will speak about some of the studies. It's early days yet. It may have potentially some sleep benefit for, I think, some individuals, but it's less clear that it's especially generalizable to all. I think it has benefits in the sense that it doesn't have a psychoactive component. So far, it doesn't necessarily seem to be having the same impact on REM sleep. We don't know about its tolerance. We don't know about withdrawal problems. But I do think there are several plausible mechanisms in my mind as to why it could work. But more generally, I think there's now emerging outside of sleep really very good data on CBD for helping people with anxiety. If you look, it seems to be something that provides what we call an anxiolytic benefit. There's been some great brain imaging studies there too. So far, I would say jury is out. Early data suggests it may not be as problematic, but the problem is there are not enough studies on just CBD alone, because usually most studies are using a combination of THC and CBD, and you therefore can't disambiguate those two. A partner of today's podcast is Shopify. Why Shopify? As someone who spends his days researching sleep and his nights researching sleep, the idea of selling merchandise was quite daunting. And you're probably thinking, what on earth is he going to be selling? We're going to start with some exciting t-shirts, all with the proceedings going directly to a new sleep education nonprofit charity that I will announce later. At the moment that we started to do that, I knew what I wanted to design, but how on earth was I going to get this sleep merch into your fantastic hands? Everyone who gave me answers gave me the same answer, Shopify. And it turned out to be remarkably simple. Without any retail experience, I was able to set up and activate my store effortlessly. Shopify's point of sale system, it's really interesting. It basically just integrates perfectly with all of the different online sales components, and it just manages everything so smoothly. Honestly, it was great. Shopify POS, it handles all the complexities of sales, inventory, and it just lets me focus on my passion, which is sleep science. Try it out. You'll see what I mean about its intuitive platform. But you should also note that Shopify isn't just for online businesses. I've heard, at least from one friend in particular, it really can help revolutionize in-person sales as well. It's one system that seems to integrate everything. If you would like an offer, here is the offer. Shopify have agreed to do a $1 per month trial. It's just $1 a month if you do shopify.com/Matt Walker. So again, shopify.com/Matt Walker. You'll get Shopify for $1 a month. That's nuts. I don't know why they're doing this for me, but it's great. Okay, let's get back to the show. Okay, do we have another question, as I was promising to try and rip through these?
Our next question is the effect of background noise on the ability to fall asleep. So these would be like white noise machines. I even heard of people just turning on the vacuum cleaner to get the baby to go to sleep, which is sort of a win-win when you think about it. So what do you think about these practices?
Okay, and this is in, you would say, sort of for people trying to combat extraneous noise. Is that the principal goal, rather than trying to lull a baby into sleep?
Yeah, I think it's mostly about the disruption, but I know that people have also used this continuous background noise to help them mask out external noise.
Yeah, so for that component, I think the paper that immediately comes to mind, it was a great study by Matthew Eben and colleagues, and they looked at the effects of white noise on sleep in individuals who are living in specifically high noise environments in, drumroll, the city that never sleeps, New York City. And I sometimes wonder, is it because there's not just so much to do, but maybe it's because it's just such a noisy urban environment. So it would make sense that they would do this study. So, what did they do in terms of that study? Well, they did what we call a within subject design, meaning that the same subjects undergo all of the treatments. Each subject, therefore, sort of acts as their own control. It's you versus your own baseline. By the way, I think I don't know if my microphone is picking up. The irony is, as I'm answering this question, there is, I think, a dog outside of this little sort of studio booth that's barking loudly. Anyway, let's hope the mic is doing its job.
It's just a live demonstration we have for you.
Exactly. Wait for Matt to turn on the white machine noise. So everyone acts as their own control, as it were. And the study had three phases, and it was really a quite clever one, particularly the last phase. The first phase was a baseline phase. The second phase was a quote unquote treatment phase, much like a drug study, but the treatment here was not a drug, it was the white noise machine. And then there was something called a washout phase. And that term washout phase comes from the drug trial literature, meaning you stop the drug and then you kind of give it time to wash itself out of the system. And so here you started with a baseline, no sound, no white noise. Then you did a white noise, which is the treatment intervention. And then you stopped using the white noise machine. Essentially, you kind of went back to your baseline again. That's the washout period. So I always tell people when they're going to do a sleep experiment, don't just do what I would call the off on experiment, which is where, let's say, you want to, I don't know, prove to yourself that magnesium doesn't really help sleep, which, if you look at the data, is debatable with the exception of maybe magnesium 3 and 8, unclear. But you would say, I'm going to look at my sleep to begin with and track it before I start taking that X supplement that some influencer said online was good. So I've got my baseline, and then I'm going to take the supplement and see if it makes a difference. And most people stop there. They say, okay, I've seen a difference. That proves to me that this is working. No, continue on. You've got one last phase of your experiment, which is stop using the supplement and prove to me that you go back to the bad sleep that you were having before. That to me is a much more powerful demonstration. And that's what they were trying to do here. Started with the off phase, then they went to the on phase, and then they went back to the off phase to see what changed. So, with all of that in mind, and by the way, I think the white noise treatment that they were using, and I have no affiliation with this company, this was part of the paper. They used a device by a company called Marpac, Marpac. Again, I have no affiliation with them, although I have tried their product. So, the white noise machine, it was placed in their participants' room at a somewhat standard distance. And then how did they measure the participants' sleep? Well, they measured it both subjectively and they measured it objectively. So, subjectively, meaning we ask you about your sleep and you tell us, how did you feel subjectively about your sleep, your sense of your sleep? And that was using a diary. And then they tracked the sleep objectively, empirically, using a sleep tracking wristwatch. And it was more of the type that we use in the sleep research world rather than a commercial one. They also recorded noise levels. So they were able to sort of sense what that background noise was. Okay, what did they find? Let's start with the objective measures and what happened when they started using the white noise machine after the baseline. Again, everyone is their own control. So, relative to your standard sleep, what changed in your noisy New York City environment after you started using the white noise machine? Well, it turns out that there was a significant reduction in the amount of time it took them to fall asleep, meaning they fell asleep significantly faster. And I think it was in the order of maybe 10 to 11 minutes, but it was highly significant. Also, they subjectively concurred with that, which is the wristwatch was telling us they fell asleep faster. And they were saying, even though they didn't know the data from the wristwatch, wow, I think I fell asleep faster when using the white noise machine. So that seems to be thumbs up for the white noise machine so far. When they looked then at a few other things, such as the number of awakenings, and we typically like people to have nice continuous sleep with few awakenings. And what they found was that there was a sort of a trend towards an improvement in their overall number of awakenings. It was a significant result, but I think if you were to sort of correct it for the number of comparisons that they did, it would be what we call a statistical trend, which is getting close, but it's not quite threshold significant. They also found a similar statistical trend, but not quite significant, but certainly in the right direction in terms of the objective measure of sleep efficiency, which is, in other words, it's related to it, which is of the total amount of time that you're in bed, how much of that time are you actually asleep? And we usually like to see you spending at least 85% of your time that you're in bed fast asleep. And sure enough, people's sleep efficiency increased significantly. And that was measured objectively. I think for me, though, the greatest interesting part was what happened during the final off. Remember, I told you you do an off and an on and an off phase. And the off phase was the washout phase when they stopped the treatment, stopped using the white noise machine. And sure enough, what they found was that when the white noise machine had been reduced, the reduction in the speed with which they fell asleep didn't go away. It seemed to persist. And I don't know what that's about. You could argue that maybe there is some imprinted memory now of, okay, when I get into my bed and I'm falling asleep, maybe you've helped teach yourself with the white noise machine the ability to fall asleep better. And that memory, and it's not necessarily a memory as if, okay, what did you have for dinner last night type memory? It's more of a physiological memory, or it's maybe even a confidence memory. But people seem to continue for the short period of the washout phase to fall asleep just as fast as they had done with the white noise machine. So I thought that was kind of
Hmm.
interesting too. However, the number of awakenings, remember I was saying that people seem to have a trend towards waking up less when they were using the white noise machine, as you would wish. But it turned out that that benefit went away once they stopped using the white noise machine, meaning that the benefit of waking up fewer times was only present when using the machine and stopped when they stopped using the machine. But more generally, I think a couple of caveats here. It was a small sample and it was a very specific demographic here. So there's limited generalization, I guess is what I'm saying. These were a small number of people, and they were all residents of a very noisy area of a very specific city in the world. We don't know how generalizable that is to most people listening if they are not in a noisy environment in New York City. That said, though, there have been now a number of different reviews where they've tried to gather together all of the different studies on white noise, machine use, and sleep, and there have been quite a few. And in general, what they found, and by the way, many of those studies were in non noisy environments, which comes back to your point earlier, Eti. And in truth, what they found was no reliable benefit of white noise machines. Now, there's an upside of that, and there's a downside of that. The upside of that is the white noise machine, at least across those studies, did not necessarily on average seem to hurt people's sleep. However, it just didn't seem to produce reliable improvement of sleep. So, in other words, I think it's going to be very dependent on the individual and the environment. I would say that I'm going to do, and this reminds me again to reach out to this fantastic individual. I'm going to do an upcoming episode with an expert on sleep and sound and noise. And there we will take a deeper dive into all of this. I think I really should do, including other types of quote unquote noise, things such as pink noise. And there have been some studies on that too. I will just say more on that soon so I can get to the next question. But before I do that, any thoughts on sleep, sound, noise, white noise machines, Etty?
Yeah, I think that when I first heard of white noise machines, it sounded a bit counterintuitive. You want to have quiet environment and then you turn on this machine that makes noise. But what I realized, and I see it all the time in our studies, once the noise is monotonous, when it's the same, then the brain can filter it out. And the strongest example is when we put people in functional MRI inside the scanner. It's a very noisy environment, but the minute they lie down and they get used to the noise because it is very repetitive, they just doze off. They fall asleep really easily. So I think that's the main advantage is when you have these sporadic noises that can wake you up and you have something that is continuous and can mask them out, that's really the benefit for sleep.
It is. And if you look at a lot of MRI studies where we just look to see what is the resting connection pattern of the brain, and we call this a resting state fMRI scan. And essentially, it's just don't necessarily do anything. We're not going to make you try and learn information or visually track things or make decisions. We're just going to have your brain essentially in idle, but that idle is much more important and informative than just idle because it shows us the functional set of connections in your brain. The problem is when you have people inside of a scanner and we just say, we're going to scan your brain for the next 5 minutes and just see if you can make your mind as blank as possible. And you get that repetitive noise, that beep, 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 and it just goes for 5 minutes. You're absolutely right. It's almost like a functional MRI lullaby. And it's a problem because all of a sudden the connective architecture of your brain is not the same when you're awake versus when you're drifting off to sleep. And in fact, a lot of those studies are confounded by the fact that probably at least half of those individuals were falling asleep in the scanner. And of course, they weren't measuring sleep because it's very hard to get electrodes inside of an MRI scanner because the magnetic strength distorts the electrical signal. So, good point. I think another good example of that is parents have probably known this over the generations ever since cars came into being. People would say, I just can't get my kid down to sleep. I don't know what it is. And they would often then just put them in the back seat of the car and just drive them around the neighborhood for about 15 or 20 minutes. And the repetitive sound of the wheels just going over and over and over and over and over and over. All of a sudden, it's just this monotonous lullaby. And the brain is almost like a pendulum, like a metronome sedation. Off you go into sleep. One of the partners of today's podcast is Levels. Levels is a cutting-edge product that allows you to track your blood sugar moment to moment during the day. And for someone like me, when I wake up, I can track and go back and look at my moment to moment blood sugar throughout the night as well. It has the best sensor technology in the industry. I started using Levels 2 years ago now, not because I was struggling with any health conditions, but I really wanted to understand how my body responded to what I was eating. I had no clue. And understand that moment to moment, and also how it impacted my sleep and how my sleep, or when I wasn't doing well with my sleep, for example, during travel and jet lag, how that was impacting my blood sugar. It was stunning regarding when my sleep was not great, my blood sugar control, despite me being usually very rigorous in what I was eating in terms of the very same things, radically different outcomes on the basis of sleep. It was such a great insight. The other thing that surprised me, though, that was hugely useful, I discovered that there were foods that are generally considered to be safe for blood sugar, but for me personally, they would actually spike my blood sugar, not in a good way. But then in the opposite direction, there were foods that when I was out to dinner with friends, and some of those friends also had Levels, it would spike their blood sugar levels. But for me, didn't change a thing. It was so fascinating to learn. It has been hugely helpful for me. I say that very genuinely. If you want to try out levels, you can go over and you can get a discount. You can get 2 free months of levels when you sign up. So go to levels.link/Matt Walker. So again, that is levels.link/Matt Walker. And I hope it's as meaningful for you. Again, levels.link/Matt Walker.
All right, next question is about melatonin. Actually, this is a very relevant topic. Sales of melatonin have nearly doubled in the pandemic relative to the time before. Many people use it. It is over the counter here in the US. So people want to know, what do you think about melatonin supplements?
Uh, Another question. It's right up there with THC, CBD. I've
Yes.
done a few episodes on this, but rather than force you to go back and listen to those, but you can if you want to get the really in-depth thing. Again, let me give sort of some higher level stuff because I think it's worth repeating. Melatonin, by the way, is a hormone, and we often call it the hormone of darkness. Some people have joked it's called the vampire hormone, not because it makes you grow very long in sizes, but simply because it comes out at night. So, the way that melatonin typically works, because it is released naturally and it does play a part in sleep wake regulation. During the day, we are hopefully exposed to plenty of natural daylight. If you don't believe me, just listen to anything that my good friend Dr. Andrew Huberman has said about this, and you will be very convinced. So, when light enters your eyes, it then goes into your brain. And one of the effects of that light is to essentially apply a metaphorical brake pedal on the release of melatonin. So during the day, when you're getting light, there is no melatonin released or very little because the light brake pedal is applied to the melatonin release mechanism. And in the absence of melatonin, it tells your brain and your body, hey, it's daytime. And if you are a diurnal species like us rather than a nocturnal species, that means that it's time to be awake. And there's a whole collection of machinery that helps force us awake, and we are waking beings. Fast forward to the evening, and now we've arrived at darkness, or at least we should have arrived at darkness. We are, I would say, a dark deprived society, and people have heard of junk food and sort of empty calories. Well, I think there's also something called junk light. And junk light is excessive electrical light in the evening. We shouldn't be exposed to that. But when we get darkness, then all of a sudden, that metaphorical light foot, as in LIGHT rather than LIT, the brake pedal of light is therefore released, and all of a sudden now melatonin starts to swell and is released into the brain and the body, into the circulation, I should say. And all of a sudden that tells your brain and body that we've transitioned from light during the day to darkness of night. And for us, a diurnal species, that tells the apparatus of our physiology it is time to sleep. And therefore it helps with the timing of sleep. But melatonin doesn't necessarily participate in the generation of sleep itself. That's a whole different set of chemicals and mechanisms. Melatonin tells your brain when it's time to sleep, but it doesn't necessarily start generating sleep. It's the timing official. So the analogy I usually use is the 100-meter race in the Olympics. And you've got that race official who brings all of the racers to the start and shoots the pistol to begin the great sleep race. But that official doesn't run the race themselves. They don't participate in the sleep race. That's a whole different set, as I said, of mechanisms. Which brings us swimmingly onto the issue of supplementation. Even though it is naturally released by your brain, lots of places here, certainly in America and in some other countries around the world, allow you to buy supplementation. And lots of studies have now looked at the effects of melatonin supplementation at different doses. If you pull them all together into what's called a meta-analysis, essentially what you find is the following. Melatonin speeds up the time it takes you to fall asleep by about 3.9 minutes on average, which is really not much more than
It's like a
placebo.
hot bath effect.
I mean, it's so small. A hot bath effect will trump that probably. And then it will only increase the quality of your sleep, what we call sleep efficiency, by just 2.2%. Remember, I was saying we like to see you at least 85% or above in terms of your sleep efficiency. Well, adding just 2.2%, it's not really going to solve your insomnia issues if that's what you're thinking for or about. So I would say that the evidence right now does not support melatonin as a particularly useful insomnia aid. That's why it's never really been used for insomnia. That's why a lot of sleep clinicians will never tell you, oh, if you're struggling with sleep and you have a hard time falling asleep or staying asleep, you should absolutely be using melatonin. Another problem is that if it's over the counter, it's not regulated by the appropriate organizations here in the United States. That would be the FDA. So, because it's deemed a supplement, the FDA does not regulate it. That means that it's a Wild West. And there has been one pioneering study that has now been replicated, and that study looked at 30 different supplies of melatonin. And what they found was that relative to what was stated on the bottle, concentrations in each pill ranged from 83% less than what was listed to 478% more than what was stated. What was even more problematic is that even within one supplier, one vendor, there was almost as much variability in one vendor from one batch to the next to the next. I would say that that is concerning for two reasons. First, you could be getting a whopping dose. Also, most people are taking a dose of melatonin that is far higher than anything your body naturally releases. Some people are taking 5 milligrams, some 10 milligrams, some people even taking 20 milligrams. That is what we call a supraphysiological dose, far higher than your body would ever naturally release. And we get concerned. Do we worry about the fact that it could shut down your body's own production of melatonin? Now, there are a couple of studies that have looked. One study that looked in a blind individual because they were trying to help regulate that blind individual in terms of their sleep rhythm because they were not getting any light signals. So they had a dysregulated circadian rhythm. And they didn't necessarily find any impact on natural melatonin release after I think it was several weeks of use. I think there was another study done in control individuals with several weeks of use of melatonin. When they stopped, their natural melatonin profile came back. And people have often cited that to me to say, well, you're scaremongering by saying it could shut down production. And you could say, well, yes, I think there is some legitimacy to what you're telling me, that I could be still scaremongering with this idea that it would shut down your natural production. But I suppose I would offer the kindly following response. Those studies were after several weeks of melatonin use. Most people aren't using melatonin for several weeks. They're using it for months, if not years. And we have no sense of what happens to your melatonin when you stop using after several years. I would also note that the pediatric use of melatonin over the counter, parents buying this in the purple lined shelves of grocery stores, has astronomically increased. Dr. Craig Canapari and I, on the episode I did with him, discussed this. I think recently the Center for Poisoning here in the United States reported that, in fact, overdose admissions to emergency rooms for melatonin overdose emergency room visits had increased by over 500% in the past 10 years, which is rather stunning. So again, I don't mean to be scaremongering. I would say probably, I think Andrew Huberman and myself have mentioned this too. There are some classic animal studies, particularly in male rats, where they were looking at juvenile male rats, which essentially is male rats in their sort of early teens as they're going through those pubertal changes and gonadal development phases. What they found was that higher doses of melatonin caused some testicular atrophy, meaning testicular shrinkage, and some testicular growth problems. Does that translate to humans? We don't know. But if you're still giving melatonin to a young teenage boy? Should you be thoughtful of that data? Maybe you should. I can't tell you that. I'm not a medical doctor, but there is some of that science out there. So I will stop there. But any thoughts on that?
I think it's a good reminder that if something is over the counter, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have physiological effects on your body. And we really just don't know enough, like you mentioned, on the long term use. We don't know enough about overdosing of melatonin, and especially in children and other developmental stages. So just don't think of it as a candy. I know some of them just come in as like little gummy bears, and it's thought to be harmless, but once it affects your body, then it can also do bad things, not just good ones.
It's such a good point, which is we think an over the counter where no one asks us about our health, no one takes our blood pressure or our temperature, no one writes a prescription script that is medical grade. We think that, well, if that's not necessary, then whatever I'm able to buy over the counter is perfectly safe for me physiologically and medically. And especially when you're playing around with hormones, and I think people fail to understand melatonin is a critical, fundamental hormone. It doesn't just regulate your wake and your sleep phases, it regulates all sorts of different things. You do have to be at least thoughtful. And all I would say again, I can't tell you how to live your life, nor should I be doing that. I would simply say that if you are thinking about taking a supplement, just make sure that you do your own diligence on it. No one else, when it comes to supplements, will have your back. So you have to take that responsibility yourself to try to at least read good, high quality science, or find people who have high, good quality science, not necessarily, again, I don't mean to be disparaging, but if you have quote unquote influencers online who don't seem to have a clinical or medical background and they're telling you everything's safe, I probably myself personally would not lean into that as an endorsement of safety for my brain and my body. I would really want to do that diligence. So there endeth my rant.
That's a great advice.
A supporter of today's podcast is Magic Spoon. I have a confession to make. I have had a love affair with cereal for most of my life, but when I started to sort of focus on wellness and health, I realized that most cereals, they were just really unhealthy, so I stopped eating them and life was much more miserable as a consequence. And then my friend, Dr. Eti, introduced me to a company called Magic Spoon, and everything changed. Magic Spoon is a fantastic cereal company. You can check them out. They have really healthy, high protein cereal. When my first box arrived, I literally just grabbed a handful and inhaled it on the spot. Magic Spoon, in addition to their cereals, which you should absolutely check out, they have now introduced Magic Spoon treats. And I have certainly added them into my panoply of things that I enjoy eating and that I use in terms of my wellness and my fitness routines. They've got 11 grams of protein, just 1 gram of sugar, just 4 net carbs per bar. And they're just really well balanced if you're looking for this type of thing. There's tons of flavors to choose from: chocolate peanut butter, blueberry, double chocolate, hashtag my favorite, strawberry milkshake, you name it, they've got it. Magic Spoon treats are available, I'm sure, at your nearest grocery store. Hunt them down. You can find them online. If you're looking for a healthy, fueling snack, I would suggest checking them out. For folks listening to this podcast, Magic Spoon has provided an offer. You can actually get $5 off your next order. And if you want that, just go over to magicspoon.com/Matt Walker. And as I said, you will get $5 off there. Let's get back to the show now.
All right, the next question, too much sleep? Something I have never considered. The question is concerns about oversleeping and potential negative effects.
Very good question. And I think I did an episode on this about too much sleep. So I would definitely suggest folks go back to but again, I'm not going to do that thing on these AMAs where we say, okay, go and listen to episode XXX. Okay, next question, because that's so unsatisfying. Let me again give the 30,000 foot view. I think central to that question are two follow-up questions. How do we define enough sleep? And how do we define what too much sleep is? And it turns out that we have very standard scientific ways to address both of these questions. One of the most widely accepted measures of optimal or enough dates back to probably the origins of modern day sleep research back in the 1960s. And it is quite simply this: if you are left to your own devices without any undue influences that would artificially prevent you from truly expressing your innate, your natural sleep needs. So we make sure that we dislocate you from work schedules, from excessive caffeine consumption, excessive evening light, remove digital technology, hopefully get you in a non-stress state. So without all of those distorting influences and roadblocks to good sleep, how much would your brain and your body naturally get in terms of your sleep? And we typically think of that as your natural, quote unquote, enough sleep need, as long as you don't have a sleep disorder. And we will check that too. Meaning that how much sleep would your brain and your body ideally settle down to and start obtaining once we clear out all of that stuff and get past the blast radius of all of that stuff lingering? And that would reflect what we would believe to be the optimal sleep need. So that's the first question. I said, how do we define enough sleep? And enough sleep would be your optimal amount of sleep. That's one way that we define it. The other way that we can define optimal sleep is, does that sleep amount, does that quote unquote enough optimal sleep result in improvements for your brain and your body rather than produce no difference in health, or even it would produce worse functioning? So I think to this question, the listener's question, in terms of what is enough and maybe what is too much, one of the most striking findings, actually, I think you may remember this finding too, came from a team in Japan. And they addressed this question by recruiting a group of healthy young participants. And I'll put an emphasis on young participants that I'll return to later. But they had those participants first track their sleep at home for approximately 2 weeks. This was imperative because it allowed the scientists to firstly determine what the participants' quote unquote typical sleep duration was. And surprisingly, in this modern day and era, there was some good news, or at least it seemed good news, because on average, those young individuals at home across that 2 week initial study period were averaging about 7.3 hours of sleep a night. And that's a handsome, what you would think of, sufficient bounty of sleep. But was it their true optimal sleep need? And that was the question. Was it the amount of sleep that was truly enough for their brain and their body to function optimally? And that's where the second part of the experiment came in. After that 2 week of at-home evaluation of sleep, the participants were then brought into the sleep laboratory for an inpatient 2 week stay. And at that point, essentially, say goodbye to your friends and your family, take your phone. They are put into ideal sleep conditions and they are monitored around the clock, 24 hours straight for 14 days. And they are using high-grade sleep laboratory or polysomnography recordings to really get a nuanced view of their sleep. Now, what happened across those 14 days? The first initial night was simply to allow the individuals to get used to the sleep recording. You throw that data away because who knows, it's just getting used to this weird environment. Now came the interesting part. For the next 9 nights straight, these individuals were encouraged, I wouldn't say enforced, they don't strap them down, but they were given 12 hours of time in bed every night. Now, even if they were awake, they said, I'm sorry, you got to stay in bed for 12 hours. What did they find in those next 9 nights? Well, remember, these individuals came into that second phase of the experiment after having averaged I think it was 7.37 hours of sleep nightly. So you would think that they are pretty well sleep rested, that they have had optimal sleep, and therefore they're just not going to sleep anymore, because that would seem optimal, surely. Well, despite that, there was still a hidden sleep debt, and they were not getting their true or natural amount. Because the first night, having been given 12 hours of sleep in bed, these individuals rocketed all the way up to sleeping 10.59 hours of sleep a night. Now, please don't misconstrue that. I want to be so clear about this point, because I think I've been guilty of it in the past. We, of course, do not think that 10.95 to whatever it was, 10.59 hours of sleep a night is either the natural sleep need or the recommended amount that every individual should be getting, and doom and gloom will happen if you don't. That's just the first night. That's what we call an artificial sleep rebound, because they still had a debt. And as you would expect, across the remaining 8 nights, things settled back down. The question was, did it settle back down to 7.37 hours a night, which was what they claimed and what they were sleeping as their quote unquote optimal sleep in the 2 weeks before? Well, by night 4, it settled down to an average of approximately 8.7 hours a night. In other words, 8 hours and 45 minutes. And of course, there was variation from one individual to the next. But a skeptic could say, well, that's findings based on just one study, because are you then going to claim that the optimal natural sleep need is 8 hours and 45 minutes? Well, that finding was then replicated by a Harvard group who combined their forces with a fantastic sleep research group in the UK from the University of Surrey. And they essentially repeated something very similar to that study. And those individuals were not quite so young. They were in their late 30s or 40s. And those individuals ended up settling down to 8.6 hours of sleep a night. Remember the Japanese group? They settled down to 8.75 hours of sleep a night. And sure enough, with that 8.6 hours of sleep a night, metrics of their brain performance improved, and metrics downstairs in their physiological body health improved. Things such as their cortisol levels and their blood sugar levels.
And their mood, I remember.
And their mood, thank you very much. Yeah, their mood improved significantly. Now, again, I want to stress this point that those studies were still in largely young individuals. So if you're listening to this and you're in your 50s or your 60s or your 70s, you should not expect to be trying to get 8.75 hours of sleep a night or 8.6 hours of sleep a night. That's not what I'm saying either. I'm simply saying that when you strip away everything that you could argue is preventing us from getting the sleep that we need, human beings seem to sleep, at least when they're in their 20s or the 30s or the 40s, a little bit more than we expected would be what we call optimal or quote unquote enough sleep. In other words, their natural tendency to sleep when everything else is removed, all roadblocks are gone, and the body and the brain just gets its chance to speak out its natural sleep number. But if you are older than that, and there's going to be a huge variation of that, that won't be the amount of sleep that is optimal for you. It will very much be less than that. But that doesn't answer the second part of the question. That was a commentary on what is perhaps enough at certain age ranges for the average individual of those age ranges. What about too much? Well, there is evidence that once you get past about 9.5 hours of sleep a night, on average, your mortality risk doesn't just keep going down and you're improving your chances of staying alive longer, but your lifespan starts to reduce again in terms of mortality risk, and mortality risk starts to go back up. And this is the phenomena of long sleep being also associated with poor health outcomes. That data is very clear. It is very well replicated. And I've done a podcast on this too that explains why that may be a little bit deceiving and confusing, but the confusion is much better understood when you understand those things. But I would say don't jump to any conclusions that that means that simply sleeping 10 and a half hours a night, if that's your natural sleep need, means that you're going to die sooner. Go back to those episodes, and I will just move past that fairly quickly because I want to get to a thought experiment. Could there be such a thing as too much sleep? Well, I actually think there could be, which was probably surprising from someone like me. But don't be fooled. That is no different than the three other critical ingredients of life, which are food, oxygen, and water. Can you overeat? Yes, you can. We see it with obesity. Can you get too much oxygen? Yes, it's called hyperoxemia, and it can cause free radical damage, and it can be particularly damaging to memory centers of the brain that are sensitive to that. Can you overhydrate? Hyponatremia. And here, what happens is that you have too much water, it dilutes the critical electrolytes in your body, especially things like sodium. And sodium is essential for your nerve cells to fire. And the biggest problem there is that the nerve cells that fire to contract your heart become disrupted, and your heart stops functioning, and overhydration can lead to the danger of heart attack. It can also induce a certain type of coma because of excessive brain swelling. And those things we keep in mind very carefully. The fourth critical ingredient of life, which I would argue is sleep, could you oversleep? Well, I think it would probably follow the same type of relationship that oxygen, food, and water do, which is not too little, not too much, just the right amount. It's the Goldilocks phenomenon. So I hope that answers the question. I've tried to pack in a lot there and speak very fast, but Etty, slow me down in terms of the facts. What have I missed? What do you find interesting? What have we not spoken about there?
I find really interesting that there is a natural sweet spot. And I really can't stress this enough. It's so critical to know your optimal sleep need because there are going to be times and stressors and challenges that are going to have to take away perhaps from your opportunity to get that sleep need. But just knowing what it is and what you're up against, I think is really, really helpful. It is interesting to think, and also studies are kind of looking into that right now, what perhaps might be going wrong with this physiological setting of how much sleep you need in terms of people that quote unquote oversleep. So I think it's fair to say that this is not a typical healthy situation. It is a sign perhaps of other pathologies in either the brain or the body.
I think you're right. And I should probably do my diligence when I was saying, but you can go back to listen to that episode. We now start to realize that in many of those studies, when people are sleeping 10 and a half hours a night, it's usually not that they are very healthy individuals who are sleeping nice and continuous, uninterrupted, healthy quality of sleep for 10 and a half hours. No, they're not. These people are usually unhealthy, and that sleep is usually of very poor quality. And so what happens is that they end up staying in bed for longer, which masquerades as quote unquote longer sleep. And the reason is because they have such bad quality of sleep. They're trying to make up for that bad quality of sleep by trying to sleep it off or stay in bed for longer. And it's the bad quality of sleep that is masquerading as longer duration of sleep that results in worse health outcomes. So, sleep quality is just as important as sleep quantity when it comes to your mortality risk. And that's the artificial bait and switch explanation that I think most of the sleep field is rallying around right now. But I still entertain the idea that there could be some degree of detriment to sleep in the extreme, 14, 15, 16 hours. I think wakefulness plays an essential role to our physiological health. And I think by sleeping, 15, 16 hours, just to do the thought experiment extreme, that would take away from healthy wakeful hours where you could be physically active, you could be getting good nutrition, you can be engaging in social activity, all of these wonderful things that keep us alive as well. Wakefulness is just as important as sleep. So I will stop there.
It's a good point. I remember once I was a young kid and I think I was just sleep deprived from waking up too early. And at one point there was this holiday and I slept 15 hours straight. And I remember waking up and my mom at my bedside looking so worried. Etsy, are you okay? Is everything? I got you some chocolate. Do you want to get out of bed? And like, I was just so tired. So I remember that. But
Well, isn't it, by the way, interesting though, what that tells us, which is that your mother innately knew that non normative sleep amounts, meaning excessive sleep amounts, are usually a sign of what? A sign of us not being well. Because when we get sick, the best intervention, or one of the best interventions that the body has in terms of fighting back against the sickness, is this thing called sleep, because of its incredible benefits on things like your immune system, your thermoregulatory system, your metabolic system, your hormonal system. And so what does it do? It dials sort of the emergency number. Back in the UK, it's 999. Here in America, it's, dial 911. The person you're dialing is that thing called sleep, and it's sort of break glass in case of emergency, sleep more, sleep more, sleep more. This is put our best health insurance policy in place. And therefore, mothers over the years have innately known that their children, when they start sleeping more, are usually sleeping more because they're probably sick or ill. Now, it was just that you were so exhausted, and that's another reason. But the reason that she was concerned and worried about you is because I think, in part, she had this innate sense that if my child is sleeping more, my child isn't well, my child is sick. It's so impressive. So those are my pleasant thoughts on you and your mother, which is, um, you didn't ask for a therapy session, did you? But anyway,
always
at,
welcome one.
you're always so kind and diplomatic. At some point in all the years that we've worked together, I'm waiting for you to actually just say, yeah, Matt, that was utter complete nonsense. And you're out of your mind, you silly British man. Anyway, coming back to a demonstration of your intelligence, anything you want to mention there, and closing out, be it on also you and your mother? I sound like Freud. If it's not
Yeah.
one thing, it's your mother. Anyway, please go on.
I really loved what you said about how the body uses sleep whenever something's wrong to try and perhaps repair it. And it just connected in my mind to what you said earlier about how people who are long sleepers tend to have a lot of disease or some sort of abnormalities. And perhaps what we're seeing is this attempt of the body to kind of use what it has to try and fight that disease. And perhaps that could explain what we see that long sleep is associated with increased mortality. It's not really the long sleep as much as what it represents kind of under the hood.
Such a good point. And I think, in fact, some researchers have had a very similar thought to you, which is if you looked at those studies where sleeping longer was associated with a shorter life, not a longer life, but higher mortality risk, and you look at the data, often those individuals were quite sick. And we know that when we get sick, the thing that we want to do is just curl up in a ball and go to sleep. We want to sleep it off, as it were. And perhaps one explanation for those data was that those individuals, whatever sickness that they were facing, maybe it was a form of cancer, and it was just too potent for sleep to combat. And so they were sleeping more to try to offer themselves some salvation of life. But it was just too much for sleep. And despite sleeping more, they still passed away too early. And therefore, it looks like sleeping more is related to a higher death risk, when instead sleep was coming to the rescue rather than being the mortality risk cause. So thank you. That's a great point. And with that, speaking about daughters, mothers, and mortality risk, what a strange way to end an episode, Matthew. But I think I should draw it to a close. Hopefully, we will try to make these AMAs a little bit shorter, but tell me on social media if you don't mind them. I will, again, do 2 rounds of thanks. Firstly, thanks to Dr. Eti Ben-Simon. If you are out there on social media as we are posting this episode, could you please send some love to Eti? Not that you haven't already. I've had so many people contact me and say, Isn't she the best? She is a wonderful addition. But please raise your hands, raise the roof. Started with what the young kids were saying. What am I doing, Matthew? Middle-aged man. But please reach out to her. Tell her how much you're enjoying her voice, her wisdom, and her knowledge. And then the second round of thanks is to you for listening to this podcast and continuing to support it. I so appreciate it. I so appreciate you, Eti. Thank you for being, again, another part of this AMA.
Such a pleasure to be here, Matt.
Thank you. And with that, we will simply wish you good night, good luck, and above all, we very much do hope you sleep well. Take care, and we will see you in the next episode.
Take care and hug your mothers.
Good advice. Fathers too.
True.